24 young men answered a newspaper ad promising $15 a day. 6 days later, 5 of them had been pulled out screaming, crying, or shaking so badly they could not stand. This is the Stanford Prison Effect, and it happened inside a university basement, not a real prison at all. In August 1971, a psychology professor named Philip Zimbardo wanted to answer one question. Are people cruel because they are bad, or because a situation makes them that way? He placed an ad in the Palo Alto Times offering $70 for 2 weeks of work and a study of prison life. 75 young men applied. Zimbardo and his team gave each of them a battery of psychological tests, screening out anyone with a history of violence, crime, or instability. What remained were 24 ordinary college students, mostly white, mostly middle class, with no criminal record and no diagnosed psychological issues. On paper, they were the most stable, unremarkable group of young men Zimbardo could find. A coin flip decided their fate. Half became prisoners, half became guards. The basement of Jordan Hall at Stanford University was converted into a makeshift prison. Zimbardo's team built 3 cells out of laboratory rooms, each barely large enough for 3 cots. They bricked over windows, removed clocks, and installed a hidden video camera behind a vent. A converted closet 2 feet by 2 feet became solitary confinement. Zimbardo called it the Hole. He gave himself a role too, superintendent of the Stanford County Prison. Not a researcher watching from outside, but a character living inside the story he had built. On Sunday, August 17th, the 9 young men assigned to be prisoners were still at home, going about their weekend, when real Palo Alto police cars pulled into their driveways. Zimbardo had arranged actual arrests, complete with sirens, handcuffs, and fingerprinting at the local police station to make the experience feel undeniably real from the very first second. Neighbors watched. Families watched. The students had no idea when it would happen, only that it would. At the mock prison, guards blindfolded each new prisoner, stripped him naked, and sprayed him with delousing powder in front of the others. He was handed a loose smock with no underwear underneath, a number stitched on the front and back, and a nylon stocking to wear as a cap, mimicking a shaved head. A chain was locked around one ankle, heavy enough to drag on the floor with every step. From that moment forward, guards were told to call each prisoner only by his number. Prisoner 8612, prisoner 819, prisoner 1037, not names. Numbers, stenciled in black marker, meant to erase whatever identity had walked in the door that morning. The 18 young men chosen to be guards received khaki uniforms, mirrored sunglasses to prevent eye contact, and wooden batons, though they were told never to use physical violence. Zimbardo gave them almost no other instructions. Keep order, maintain control. Beyond that, he told them, improvise. He wanted to see what they would build on their own, with nothing more than a badge and a uniform, separating them from the men in the cells beside them. For the first several hours, nothing dramatic happened. Guards felt awkward giving orders to their fellow students. Prisoners treated the whole thing like a game they could quit whenever they wanted. That illusion collapsed fast. On the morning of day 2, prisoners barricaded their cell doors with their beds and refused to come out for the count. It was the first real test of who actually held power in that basement, and the guards responded with force nobody had planned for. They called in reinforcements from the off-duty shift, sprayed the rebelling prisoners with carbon dioxide from fire extinguishers, stripped the ringleaders naked, and threw the mattresses out of the cells entirely, leaving prisoners to sleep on bare concrete. The prisoner they identified as the instigator, number 8612, was placed in solitary confinement, alone in the 2-foot closet. By day 3, the guards had split the prisoners against each other. They created a privileged cell for prisoners who had not joined the rebellion, giving them their beds back and better food, while punishing the rest. Within a day, the guards dismantled that arrangement too, mixing rebellious and cooperative prisoners together at random, a move designed purely to make the group distrust each other. It worked. Prisoners stopped trusting fellow prisoners. Solidarity, which had briefly threatened the guards' control, evaporated inside 72 hours. The guards began conducting counts at 2 in the morning and again at 2:30, waking prisoners repeatedly through the night for no operational reason at all. They forced prisoners to do push-ups, sometimes with a guard's boot resting on a prisoner's back. They ordered prisoners to clean toilets with their bare hands. They made prisoners sing songs, recite their numbers on command, and perform humiliating exercises for no purpose except to remind them who was in control. Not every guard participated equally. Some stayed passive, enforcing rules without cruelty, but roughly a third of the guards, according to Zimbardo's later accounting, escalated into behavior he described as genuinely sadistic, inventing new degradations every shift and appearing to enjoy it. Prisoner 8612 broke first. Less than 36 hours in, he began experiencing what the research team described as acute emotional disturbance, uncontrollable crying, disorganized thinking, and rage he couldn't explain even to himself. Zimbardo initially suspected he was faking it to get released early. When the research team realized the distress was real, they let him go. It did not stop there. Prisoner 819 developed a breakdown after overhearing other prisoners chanting that he was a bad prisoner, sobbing so hard he could barely speak, still trying to prove himself by staying inside the study, even as his body fell apart in front of the staff. On the fourth day, Zimbardo arranged a visiting hour for parents, but he ran it like a real warden managing a real institution, worried more about the prison's image than the well-being of anyone inside it. He had the prisoners groomed and fed a real meal beforehand, swept the hallway, and played music to make the environment feel calmer than it actually was. One mother, watching her son, began crying, sensing that something was deeply wrong even though she couldn't say exactly what. Zimbardo, deep inside his role as superintendent, redirected her concern back toward logistics and moved the family along. He also brought in a real Catholic priest, former prison chaplain, to interview the prisoners, treating the study as though it had crossed fully into reality. The priest told several prisoners that the only way out was through a lawyer and offered to contact their families. One prisoner, hearing this, broke down completely, no longer certain if he was participating in an experiment or actually in prison. The turning point came from someone who was never a subject in the study at all. Christina Maslach, a recent Stanford PhD graduate and Zimbardo's own girlfriend at the time, was invited to observe the prison and conduct interviews with the guards and prisoners for a side project. Walking the corridor on the evening of day 5, she watched a line of shackled, hooded prisoners being marched to the bathroom by guards barking orders, and something in her recoiled. She would later say it was the only time in this entire study that she cried. When she confronted Zimbardo that night, telling him what he had built was not an experiment anymore, but something closer to abuse, they had a serious argument, the first real conflict of their relationship. Zimbardo, hearing his own justifications come out of his mouth in that argument, realized how deeply he had absorbed the role of superintendent himself. The next morning, August 20th, 1971, Zimbardo ended the Stanford Prison Experiment. It had run for 6 days. It was supposed to run for 14. In his later writings, Zimbardo called the guards' cruelty and the prisoners' collapse a demonstration of what he named the Lucifer effect, the idea that ordinary, psychologically healthy people can commit or endure extraordinary cruelty once a situation, a system, and an authority structure give them permission. Not bad apples, he argued. A bad barrel changes the apples inside it. The study became one of the most cited pieces of research in the history of psychology, taught in nearly every introductory course for the following 4 decades, referenced in congressional testimony, and cited directly by military lawyers during the Abu Ghraib prison abuse investigations in 2004, where Zimbardo himself testified as an expert witness. But the story most people know is not the whole story. Decades later, French sociologist Thibault Letexier gained access to Zimbardo's original archived recordings and interview notes, material that had sat largely unexamined since 1971. What he found complicated the legend considerably. Recordings showed research staff actively coaching guards to be tougher, specifically telling one guard nicknamed John Wayne that he wasn't being harsh enough and needed to escalate. Several guards later admitted in interviews that they were performing what they believed the researchers wanted to see, not spontaneously discovering cruelty on their own. Prisoner 8612 himself said years later that his breakdown was partly an act, a way to get released so he could return to studying for an exam, though he also insisted the psychological pressure inside the prison was genuinely overwhelming regardless of his performance. In 2001, 2 British psychologists, Stephen Riker and Alexander Haslam, tried to replicate the entire setup for a BBC documentary called the BBC Prison Study. They built a nearly identical mock prison, recruited a similar pool of ordinary volunteers, and ran cameras around the clock. The result was almost the opposite of Stanford. The guards never bonded into a unified group and never developed a shared identity as authority figures. The prisoners, given time, did the opposite of what happened in Gordon Hall. They organized, developed solidarity, and eventually took over the institution themselves. Riker and Haslam argued that tyranny is not automatic once a uniform and a badge appear. It only takes hold when people are actively guided toward believing that cruelty is the righteous, expected choice, exactly the kind of guidance the original Stanford staff had quietly provided. This does not erase what happened in that basement. It reframes it. The guards were not simply ordinary people spontaneously discovering a hidden capacity for cruelty. They were ordinary people responding to explicit and implicit instructions from an authority figure who wanted a specific outcome and who was, by his own later admission, embedded in the experiment as its superintendent rather than observing it from a distance. The line between demonstrating how situations corrupt people and actively directing people toward corruption turned out to be much thinner than the original study ever admitted. What remains undisputed is what the 6 days actually produced. 5 young men suffered genuine psychological breakdowns severe enough to require early release. A woman who had no stake in the research had to be the one to say the word abuse out loud before anyone with authority over the study would listen. The professor lost track of where his role ended and his research began, until an outsider's tears forced him to see it. And 24 ordinary students, screened specifically for their stability, discovered in under a week how quickly a number stitched onto a smock, a pair of mirrored sunglasses, and a basement with no clocks could rewrite who they were willing to become. Zimbardo spent the rest of his career trying to answer the question the criticism raised without ever fully resolving it. Was it the situation that turned ordinary people cruel? Or was it always possible to nudge ordinary people toward cruelty simply by telling them, directly or indirectly, that cruelty was expected of them? He never fully separated the two answers. Maybe they were never separate to begin with. Maybe every prison, real or invented, runs on both truths running side by side. A system that creates the conditions, and someone standing just outside the frame quietly telling the guards to push harder. Jordan Hall still stands on the Stanford campus today. The basement corridor where prisoner 8612 screamed that he was burning up inside is now used for ordinary classes, students walking past it with no idea what the walls once held. The 18 mirrored sunglasses are gone. The chains are gone. What is left is a question nobody has closed, sitting quietly under a university building in California, waiting for the next situation to test who was willing to answer it. Don't forget to support the channel. A like, a subscription, and a bell are the best thanks and motivation to release new videos.